And besides, I can't hear it later on. If you have any questions, my wife certainly will come up and do that. Pete and I weren't at Dangberg in a contemporary sense. He predated me by 2 or 3 years at least. Can you hear him back okay?
Yes.
Okay. I worked there after I got out of dental school in 1975. Gardnerville was still pretty small, and Dangberg was the biggest place there. They had sheep, cattle, pigs, at one time dairy cows. It was a pretty diversified ranch. And we'll get into that a little bit. Pete was there much earlier, he didn't stay, I don't think, until 1950, but it was close. But his time at Dangberg, as it says here, was legendary. To many in the American West, the Basque regions of France and Spain seem like idyllic farm country. Can you see okay? Despite the pastoral beauty, this region in the mid-20th century offered little economic opportunity. I was just talking to my neighbor at lunch, and his family came from Portugal because of the same limited economic opportunity for anyone other than the oldest child in a Basque family. This is a view of a Hawks in Basse-Navarre, France, where Pete Lanathoua's family is from. The agricultural methods of the Basque were rudimentary. You can imagine what the front compartment of your thigh would look like if you worked one of those 8 hours a day. It's got one leg to operate and a number of forks, and if you look, they're coming across, and I know it's hard to see in the back, coming across that entire hill, harrowing with those. Were rudimentary and physically demanding. Even more significant was the fact that this land and hard work would only earn a subsistence wage. The pay would never allow a worker to buy his own place. Pete's father, Charles Lanathoua, was born June 1st, 1900. Pictured here in 1918, Charles was at a prime age for induction and service in the French Army. During his service, he saw the world outside of the Basque country, and he wanted to see more of it. After a period of time back home, Charles' wanderlust took over, and he journeyed from Le Havre to New York, aboard the Lafayette, which is pictured here. He arrived in America on July 30th, 1923, having been at sea for 9 days. His final destination was the area around Susanville, or in Basque, Susanville, California, where he would herd sheep and be involved in general agriculture. He remained in America until 1929. Having saved most of the money he earned while in America, Charles returned to France and used his earnings to buy a farm. Many Basques who went to America never returned to the home country. In fact, many of them, because of the isolation of the herding jobs that they had, would go in the winter to the Basque hotels and spend all their money and be forced to go back out and herd again. Not with Charles. Charles was an exception, and in 1930, he married Marie du Halde at Hawks, France. It was into this marriage that Pete Lanathoua was born on January 10th, when he really was 90, 1932. So, here's the groom and the bride. In some ways, Pete was very lucky. Unlike many Basques, Charles actually owned the farm in which his family now lived. By all accounts, Pete received a rudimentary education, proper religious training, and a firm dose of hard work. The education included a bit of what his father had learned in America, mixed in with old country Basque traditions. Pete, on the far right in this picture, with his siblings, Jean-Léon, Anna, and Britt. On the farm, there were many hardships during World War II, but a lack of food was not one of them. The Lanathoua family was joined by Pete's cousins, who stayed on the farm for safety as the war raged around them. There were 13 at the table, and 11 of them were in school. Pete's dad was the only one working. It was also a time of sadness because Pete's mom passed away in 1939 from complications of childbirth. Pete was only 7 years old. The mind of a young man is powerful. And when men of the village got together socially, Charles' stories about America fueled a wanderlust in Pete, which could not be easily suppressed. He knew he wanted to go to America, as his father had done. Pete had relatives in America, and he was determined to go. Pete's great uncle, Guillaume Grenade, arranged a job for Pete at the eponymous H.F. Dangberg Land and Livestock Company. Pete, pictured here, you can tell because when Pete sent me the photo, he marked it. He didn't want me to be confused. Thank you, Pete, I appreciated it. Pete took a train from Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port to Bayonne and another train to Paris. From Paris, he with other Basques flew to London, where Pete recalls the food being god-awful. Someone asked the other day, and I never thought of this, they said, the British sent ships all around the world looking for spices. Why didn't they put them in their food? Another flight took him to New York, where, after having a great meal at Valentine Aguirre's High Life restaurant, he spent the night at Aguirre's Santa Lucia Hotel. Next came another flight that ended in Salt Lake City. Uncle Martin Lanathoua, who had paid for Pete's travel to America, met Pete there, and together they traveled by train to Reno, Nevada. Another full Basque meal in the restaurant, which still had family-style service. Pete and Martin spent the night at the new Santa Fe, which is no longer new or the Santa Fe, at the new Santa Fe Hotel. The next morning, they boarded the V&T for Minden, 44 miles away. Pete's travel adventure ended with a short trip from Minden. This is actually the depot in Minden, Nevada. Gone now. A few of the buildings are still the same. The train tracks are gone. Everything changes. Short trip from Minden, which is where the train ended, to Gardnerville. Here, Pete and Martin Lanathoua met with Guillaume, Bill, or William Grenade at the Overland Hotel. Guillaume worked as a bread baker and camp tender in Hope Valley for H.F. Dangberg Land and Livestock. Same place. After the sheep came out of Hope Valley in the fall, Guillaume would return to his family in Carson City. On October 10th, 1949, Guillaume took Pete to his new job at the Dangberg Company's Buckeye Ranch. Pete spoke neither English nor Spanish, only Basque and French. This is filled with houses now, but at the time, on the east side of the irrigated area of Carson Valley, Buckeye was the headquarters for the sheep portion of the Dangberg operation. The company had about 9,000 ewes, which comprised 9 bands of sheep. However, Pete was not immediately given a herder job. It seems the company camp tender was a Spanish Basque, and he did not treat French Basques with kindness or respect. Pete became a fence builder. He also loaded hay on horse-drawn wagons, much as you see here. Helped with lambing and took firewood to the herders who had a band of sheep on the stubble fields. After they hayed it off, the company would use those fields for feed. In this picture, the low-lying interlocking panels, which Pete became an expert at assembling and disassembling, moving in each area, which contained the sheep, are not shown. Those panels ensured that each section of the pasture was properly grazed on grass stubble, and I got the figures from Pete, so if anybody wants to contest them, they can. It was every 4 days. On alfalfa stubble, it was 3 days, and on clover, it was every 2 days. Pete would take the panels apart, move them, then reassemble the makeshift corral in the new grazing area. Here, the field is not being utilized to its fullest. The company was Dangbert, was finicky and did not believe in waste or incomplete usage. Pete's next job at Dangbert began when one of the seasoned herders quit. The herders' band would become Pete's band. No longer would he sleep in the comfort of the bunkhouse at Buckeye, nor would he have 3 meals a day prepared for him by the ranch cook. John Dangbert, the company president, ate his breakfast each morning at Buckeye, and no longer would Pete see him every morning. He was on his own and had a band of only 600 ewes. Well, 600 ewes, that's not enough. Well, actually it was, because they all had twins. Pete was suddenly in charge of 1,800 animals, and he was isolated in the sagebrush foothills of the Pine Nut Mountains, which are east of where Minden and Gardnerville are now. The bands came in from the hills for lambing and then back to the pine nuts. By late spring, it would be time to take the band to Hope Valley. Pete, being new, needed an experienced hand to guide the way to the mountains to the west. Person shown to show Pete the way was Dominique Laxalt. This is Robert Laxalt, who would later be called the voice of the Basques in America. By 1950, Dominique had sold his own sheep and became a camp. Huh?
Can you speak a little louder?
Sure. I'm sorry. Who was that woman? By 1950, Dominique had sold his own sheep and became a camp tender for Dangbert. Life in town was generally too confining for him, but having spent many years on the range in a tent, he was happy to return each night to Carson City and sleep in his own bed. Dominique traveled with Pete in the day and showed him where to camp with water by night. They crossed from the Pine Nut side of the west of 395. I'm sorry. They crossed from the Pine Nut side on the east to the west of 395, where the Carson Valley Golf Course is now located. From the Pine Nuts to Hope Valley took 5 days to travel. Pete would have one of 6 or 7 bands of sheep in Hope Valley. He would be first at Horse Meadows and then in Hope Valley itself, and then follow the creek to Horse Thief Meadows. The camp tender would bring fresh groceries each week. However, there was a problem. Pete only knew how to cook eggs. Remember, he was just 18 and had never been on his own before this time. Because there was so much feed, the sheep stayed pretty close and did not wander far. Pete had a friend and a fellow worker named Felipe Area who came to visit one day. He said, "Pete, you look awful. What have you been eating?" Pete admitted that he had only had eggs for well over a month. Felipe thought Pete's kidneys were failing, and he immediately taught Pete how to make stew. Pete said stew saved his life. One day the camp tender came and said Pete needed to have the ewes and the lambs and the sheep camp on the floor of Hope Valley the next day. A buyer was coming to inspect the lambs. Pete followed his orders and was there the next morning. Pete's lambs averaged 92 pounds, which was excellent for twins. Felipe's averaged more than 100 pounds. and John Dangberg bought Felipe a new pair of shoes for his excellent work. Pete and his ewes returned on the trail to the Carson Valley and set up in one of the stubble fields. The same wanderlust which brought Pete to America plays hard on a young man. Later, Pete would say the company was the best herding job he ever had, but at 18, he wanted to see more of the world. After Dangberg, and while working for Fred Fulston around Bridgeport, California, Pete decided he didn't want to fight the snow for another winter. His Fulston herd had passed a herd of JB Saldebeher sheep on the trail. JB said, and this is the part that fits the best here, "Come to Bakersfield in the fall, I will have a job for you." Pete did just that and started with Saldebeher in 1951. In fact, Pete and his father, Pete had had a few chorizos at this one. No longer the skinny Pete from the old country. 185 pounds then, Pete? Something like that. In fact, Pete and his father both worked for Saldebeher in 1955. Pete even returned to Buckeye. The company bucks had such a good reputation that J.B. Saldebeher rented his bucks from Dangberg. When Pete and J.B. were returning the bucks, Bill Mullins, the sheep boss at Dangberg, said to Pete, "I think I know you." Pete replied, "Yes, I used to work for you." Pete remained in agriculture until 1963, working on ranches and milking cows. By 1963, however, Pete needed a change and took a job bartending at Centro Basco in Chino. Pete's life got way better when he met and married Judy Chechi. They would have their own restaurant, the Bass Cottage, in the City of Industry, and were very successful. The long hours proved to be hard on their health, so after 6 years of double shifts, they moved to Bakersfield, and Pete got a job hauling cotton on a valley farm. Pete became a proud citizen of the United States in 1996. Here he's celebrating with his family on that joyous occasion. Judy would eventually return to the restaurant business as a hostess, and Pete would become a 5-day-a-week bartender at WoolGrowers in Bakersfield. As of early 2020, he still worked a full shift and a full week at the age of 88. It's said that he makes the best pecan punch in town.
That's right.
If you're ever in Bakersfield, stop and see him. It will be well worth your trip. Finally, by 2021, both Pete and Judy had retired, and we're lucky to have them here today and to celebrate Pete's birthday. So.
my God.
Oh my God.